What is going on, you guys? It's your boy, the Tupperware Tyrant here, and we are back with episode 133 of the video game therapy series. I want to start today off just by, this is again, it's probably up there with the stupidest take, not really stupidest, but just most inconsequential things. I really feel like, Larry David kind of complaining about this, but I'm just not a fan of Tupperware. I think in general, Tupperware does not. In the sense that it serves its purpose, but of like containing food. But I'd almost just eat with my hands than to use Tupperware, because you know I don't feel healthy eating out of Tupperware because, well, it's like plastic, and especially if you're heating it up, whether you heat it up before you put it in the Tupperware, it just feels like I'm still, melting microplastics, and in some way am, you know, becoming impotent or something by eating the food out of that. So not only is like the health, the safety health factor a part of it, but then it's like even the food I'm eating out of Tupperware, I still feel like doesn't. It's never conducive to being like a healthy. Like no one eats a salad out of Tupperware, right? I've never seen any even a shred of lettuce or arugula inside of a Tupperware container. Maybe some people do eat salads out of Tupperware, but I've just never seen that. So that's just not really what I envision with Tupperware. Um, and then lastly, just like the I guess what did I cover? Like the medical health part of it, the actual like food health of it. But then just like the taste. I don't know that any like Tupperware is gonna make anything taste decent. And like you're not eating like a fillet out of a Tupperware. It's just even if you are eating fillet, it's like a secondhand. It's been cooked like 3 times already because it's a 2 week old fillet. So it's just gross in terms of actual taste. So you're not really enjoying even the process of eating anything out of Tupperware. It's almost like the equivalent to food of like a hamburger helper where and I haven't eaten hamburger helper in probably 15 years, so I'm not saying that is a something I'm familiar with, at least in any recent level. But it's just not like yeah, it's food. I'm not saying it's not food. In the sense, I'm not saying that Tupperware isn't, cutlery in the sense where it's not, or silverware, I guess, or whatever you call it. Um, you can certainly eat things out of it, right? It certainly is dishware, on one level, not denying that, but it is just the lowest, part of it. At every point in the process of eating a meal out of Tupperware or with Tupperware, I feel a sense of shame and like I shouldn't be doing this. Not even in like a good way, because sometimes there's like I guess if you're indulging in some, if you're eating ice cream or something, like, oh, I shouldn't be doing this. But that's like more for your health. Whereas this just feels like unhealthy on every level and wrong. I'm just not a fan of Tupperware. I just think it's gross. Plus, it's just like annoying. It's like you're reusing stuff that doesn't really seem like it should be reused. And if you, and because like ceramic stuff, I feel smart. Or not I feel smart. I feel better about putting that in a dishwasher. Whereas like putting Tupperware stuff into a dishwasher just feels. It's like I kind of almost just don't want to throw it away because it's it's plastic. It's crap. It's not like meant to be reused. It is meant to be reused, but it doesn't feel like it's meant to be reused. Whereas a ceramic plate or even just like, a plastic plate, while not being as elegant as, a ceramic plate of some kind, and still probably just as cheap as Tupperware, still feels, reusable. Now I know the whole appeal of Tupperware is it's leftovers, and maybe this boils down to me just not being a leftovers guy. I don't like leftovers. I've never liked leftovers. I think like the food should be eaten at that time. I enjoy being a part of the clean plate club. So if I order food, I want to eat all of it, unless they're something I physically can't eat. But that generally doesn't happen. So I like finishing all the food I have. I don't like eating something a second time. It's never, tell me what's better the second time, eating it than eating it the first time. And there's very few things I would even eat cold. Um, period. And even if you heat it up, then it's never better heated up in a microwave or I guess baking it might be better or a toaster oven or something. But it's always it's never a win. And you don't really put besides pasta, like bready carbs don't really go into Tupperware. So it's not like even like secondhand pizza can be pretty good. That doesn't really go in Tupperware because Tupperware has those sectioned areas, and a slice of pizza often never fits into the whole part of Tupperware. So I don't know. As a whole, I just don't like the idea of Tupperware. I don't enjoy it. I don't use it at all. I don't like it. I don't even know why I felt the need to share this. I just don't like Tupperware. So that's kind of how I'm kicking this episode off. So anyway, fuck Tupperware. Um, let's move to something else here. I kind of had a moment where I felt like I was losing my mind in a grocery store. Maybe, I don't know, some people can relate to this. Yes, let's fucking go. I got a fucking trident. That's huge. Um, anyway, I felt like I had a moment where I was losing my mind a little bit in the grocery store. It just felt like, I often joke and think about like, living in a dystopia or, whatever that means. And I don't think we'll ever really like, you know, it's not like people, you will be born into knowing this is a dystopia. It's not like we're in movies like, I'm trying to think of like 1984 or Brave New World or things. People, not even Brave New World. Brave New World is like I guess, a dystopia in a utopia like setting of some kind. Regardless, like everyone knows in 1984, this is a dystopian novel. It's like even the characters themselves know they're in a dystopia. It's almost like being born into slavery or something. You kind of, all right, you're a slave. It's not like you have any illusion of freedom, right? It's like at no point was any slave like, oh, what are you talking about? I'm not a slave. It's like everyone knows that like this is a horrible existence, and like this is not the way you'd want to live your life if you had the choice. Like this is horrible, and I think we'll never really like know that for sure. Where people that are being born into the world will never be like born and raised being told that this is a dystopia. And maybe there's a few parents that were cynical as fuck and are poisoning their children's mind by saying this is like it's all over. But I had a moment where it really felt like the dystopia had bubbled up to a almost not a breaking point in the sense that I was losing my mind, but it just felt like it was you know incredibly apparent to me. So I was in a grocery store, and if you live in any kind of I guess area in America where there's a bunch of grocery stores, almost none of them have like actual people to check you out. Sure, they have like 10 aisles of people that work the checkouts, but unless you're there during rush hour and there's a ton of people, there might be one of those open. It's pretty much exclusively self checkout. So everyone's only ever checking themselves out. Nobody really uses like and like a grocery bagger doesn't exist anymore. At least in my part of the country. Maybe there's, I don't know, in Kansas or something, people still bag groceries, but that is like that's like a it's like seeing a unicorn. That just never happens. Um, anyway, but and I think every single grocery chain that I've seen ever all has adopted the same like automated voice system. And they say like the same things. It's like it begins with welcome valued customer. Please scan item. Please return item. Help is on the way. And so it was a point where I was in there, and there was probably like 5 or 6 of us checking out at once, and it just felt like one of those scenes in a movie where the world is kind of closing in, and I kept hearing welcome valued customer. Please return item. Please return item. Help is on the way. It's like it just happened so like it was just timed up so perfectly and with such intensity, and I felt like they had like turned the volume up on these guys, and I was just being harassed. But the fact that it was just like instead of saying like obey orders, it was like welcome valued customer. It's just the irony of saying welcome valued customer from an automated voice machine. It's like you're just telling me I'm not valued. What do you mean welcome valued customer? By you not hiring somebody to actually check me out. I mean, uh, sure. And some people might make the argument is like, well, I'd rather have like, a self checkout machine. I don't have to talk to anybody. It's not mean to me than like, somebody who's like, making minimum wage and is like pissed off to be there. Maybe they're even rude. Maybe it's like someone who's legitimately rude checking you out. Maybe that's like the argument, the counter argument for like, well, that's why we like the self checkout machines. But there needs to be something said about just the humanity of a thing, right? Like there's clearly there is a level of humanity, even with a rude person behind the counter. Even like in New York, if you go to bodega, there's some. I mean, not being most of the time it's a foreign person who's checking you out, and most of the time they're a true New Yorker in the sense that they're not like, how are you doing? It's like, oh, this is delicious. You're gonna love this. No, it's like they just check you out and they get you out. But there's a certain level of dignity that's associated with that interaction. It's like I just feel like I'm a human. I'm in New York. I'm kind of getting harassed by this foreign looking gas station agent or bodega agent that is kind of rudely giving me my things. But there's an element of this feels human, and this feels like I'm living a life, right? Whereas now with this automated checkout systems, I never get that feeling that this is that just feels dead to me. So I know there's an argument behind like the practicality, like, oh, I hate talking to people, and I don't like people that are rude to me, or that I don't like being judged for my weird purchases. Like for one thing, what are you buying that's so weird at a gas station? And like unless you're buying like I don't know Diddy levels of lube and condoms or something, what's to be ashamed of anyway? And the thing is, if you are ashamed of the food that you're buying, maybe that says more about you than it does about the person judging you at the checkout counter, right? And sure, I'm not. I'm sure there are people that, psychoanalyze people for buying 1 quart of ice cream or something like that. And I'm not advocating that for them to run the world either. But regardless, there is a certain level of dignity with having a human do a job that just feels like a human should do the job, versus making a machine do it and then excusing all of the uh, I guess the dystopian overtones that come with that. So anyway, I just feel like I had a breaking point, not a breaking point, but a real wow, this is fucked up moment, in the gas station when I was just kind of hearing those voices, and I guess if I was more schizophrenic, I'd probably hear that when I go to sleep. Welcome, valued customer. But I'm not, thankfully. So anyway, I just felt like I needed to write that down and to talk about how awful that was, just because of that being something that happened. I guess speaking of food, I just think modern food is, and maybe I've covered this before previously, but I think just modern food is too good. It's like we've just kind of not that we've like perfected dishes and things like that. Sure, we have. I think maybe you could even make the argument that we've perfected like certain dishes of desserts and things. But I think food itself was never designed, not designed as if there was some intention behind it, but food was never meant to be, meant by God or whoever to be this good. Like in the sense that people have, you know, again, they have like these pathological relationships with food. Because I mean, the overweight, obesity epidemic to be one thing, clearly like a huge part of that is it's psychological in nature. And I would argue that sure, you could point at the humans themselves and say you're just a lazy piece of shit, stop eating Doritos, like whatever. But not to take the spotlight off them, because I think they maybe they need to really look in the mirror. It is about them, after all. But I think there is something to be said about the food itself, and how like instead of it being like anything remotely natural, and things of tasting good because they're fresh and natural, things now are just like engineered to a level of brain hacking that I feel like is problematic, you know, for the long term flourishment of humanity. And maybe there is slightly less of the people themselves to blame than the food that is being served to them, that is quite literally like impossible like not to like, right? Like with the amount of sugar and butter in a dish, it's almost difficult to say like, well, this is gross. And like maybe if you have like a very like light and refined palate, and whatever, but most of the time people are so hungry, or just so like beholden to their urges and their hormones of you know ghrelin and testosterone, or whatever the or estrogen, I suppose, is the feeding hormone. Um, that and food is so full of sugar and butter and savoriness and sweetness that it's like it's almost like impossible to fault them for liking it, even things that are just blatantly disgusting. Um, and I know this runs contrary to a lot of my opinions on people having self control and realizing that. But I'm not. There is fault to be put on the people, the manufacturers of food itself, because it has kind of become this thing that is so perfected, and not perfect in the sense that it's like a perfect dish. It's perfect in the eyes of making somebody fat and addicted. That like in that sense, it is perfect. But whereas in my eyes, a perfect thing would be perfect in terms of its nutritional value and fostering a long-term relationship with food that is sustainable and healthy. Because that's really ultimately what it boils down to, is because food is so, I'll say so good, in that way, modern food. Where is he? I just heard it. Oh no. Don't make me lose him. Because food is so good, hang on a second. I've lost him. Whatever. I tried to find that Trident guy that I heard, but I must have just missed him. I'm gonna get more potions. But I think food now has just become, and people have created these strong emotional relationships with something that wasn't ever meant to be an emotional relationship. I don't think evolutionarily we were meant to have this romantic almost relationship with a burger, right? Whereas like historically people and I've even heard this a couple times recently. It's like one of those things where you hear something once and you just kind of hear it all over again. It's like, well, some people live to eat, other people eat to live. I think people that eat to live, that's kind of the way that we were raised biologically or evolutionarily. We evolved to kind of eat as a way of sustenance, and by necessity, and not as a result of like, having the choice of like, what fillet to get or whatever. There wasn't like this weird kind of romantic pathological relationship with food. It was it was a necessity. You ate it because you needed to survive. But now that people like live to eat, it almost seems strange that like this necessity has become this like this primary focus of your life, and you're like, well, what am I going to eat next? And it's not even that like you're not allowed to have like, I'm not saying nobody should have like a an interest in food as a passion. Like food can be a passion, that's fine. I'm not saying it can't. And like if you're a chef and you appreciate that, but I think the number of people and the extent to which they treat food and like it's not. I don't view it in the same way as like a mechanic loves fixing cars and like a foodie loves eating food. At some point there is kind of this like this limit. It's like I would say it's weird if a mechanic was trying to fuck his car. In the same way, it's like the amount of food that you're eating and like the amount of effort you're putting into this. And it's really just probably more so the amount and like the type of food that you're eating that I would say, all right, there's a problem here. Like you can enjoy cars, you can enjoy food, but like you can't fuck your car, dude. Like that's just not appropriate. And maybe that's just one, a societal line that that I would want to draw. I'm not saying that everyone has to have that same opinion, but again, I just think that is there becomes a point where it is a toxic relationship with food. And I think if you look at the obesity epidemic, that would that kind of helps prove my point, at least with that. There's clearly is a problem somewhere, right? And so the food is a problem on one end with people's self control, and I'm not saying that is what I would argue is a huge part of the problem. Maybe 80% of it, but then 20% is just the fact that we've done so much effort into making foods as addictive as possible and like impossible not to turn down. So you almost need to have some kind of dietary or medical problem to actually avoid eating the stuff that have. It's just, and even you hear people describe like food in restaurants or something. It's always like it almost becomes its own spectacle. Whereas the spectacles used to be like feats of humanity, where it's like we would it's like we'd go on the moon, or we'd like create a piece of work, or an art, or a play of some kind, or a movie. Now it's like, oh my god, did you try that fried chicken ball or whatever the fuck it is? I don't even know. Like now that's a spectacle in and of itself, right? People now we've evolved to we haven't evolved, but we've I guess devolved to having that be its own spectacle of like do you see how unnutritious and and how addicting this food is? So I don't know. I'm not saying that food to everyone has to be. I'm sure there are foodies that are healthy and are I guess intelligent about the way they manage their their hobby. But I just think in general, too many people, and the data would back me on this, too many people are pathological in the way that they treat food, which I think is not going to be is not good. So anyway, um, yeah, let me look at my list here. Pick something else. Um, yeah, this is what I'll talk about this, just because it's often a topic. I think a big way that younger people like me differ from people that are older is that there is this, there is this kind of inbuilt, uh, I'll say nihilistic attitude or cynical attitude with people in my generation as compared to the boomers or the Gen Z people with regard to technology. And I think some people tend to view this in the lens of like, almost like they're like that we're ungrateful for like the developments and advancements we've had in technology. Because people will say, look, isn't it amazing that like technology can do all this? And on the surface, as a feat of humanity, it's not like I'm not pissed off that we like went to the moon, right? That's not what I mean by being frustrated with developments in technology. But it's almost like people in my generation have grown up feeling and being told how inferior we are to machines, and not in a way that and sure we've I'm sure we've reaped benefits that are in large part ignored by us socially, um, but we grew up feeling like shit compared to what machines can do, and almost like this level of competition where it's like, well, machines are so more useful, then like why are you even alive? It's almost like that's almost where I think a good chunk of this nihilistic or cynical behavior comes from, is people that have so perpetually been told how inferior and how useless they are when compared to, a fucking bash script that, I guess automates some bullshit that the boomer wants to do. That it's almost like, fuck that machine. Like, I'm better than that, and I think people don't, that's why I think there needs to be almost this secondary embrace, this, kind of new age of romanticism that is respectful, or at least, honorable to what humans can actually do, because humans are superior to machine in many ways. I think a big way that we could recognize this is that our ability to recognize nuance. Now, ironically, in our efforts to become more robotic and more, uh, because I've said before that I think that, like, this huge twist of irony is that we're trying to make machines that are more like humans, and then us humans are trying to be more like machines. Like, everyone's on some big productivity, binge. We're trying to find the supplements and vitamins to keep us focused for 40 hours a day. It's like all this bullshit to try to make us more like a machine that can work longer, and you have this perfect, all this other bullshit that, instead of like kind of embracing, the many unknowns and nuances that make us very human. Whereas the robots themselves are trying to, like, program nuanced thinking into, right, and like make them more, human esque. It's just this huge, like, twist of irony. But human machines themselves have very little understanding of nuance. And of course, then, you could say the exception to this would be, like, large language models that, I can ask it for a balanced take or something like that, but it itself has no recollection of what, nuance is, or, even like the subtleties of something, that, or even bringing meaning out of nothing, right? You can take pictures, you could, take a computer cloud, you're looking at clouds, and in humans we see many different things, and we see patterns that don't exist, or even patterns that, quite literally we don't, we've just invented for ourselves as a result of our, many, neuropathies and things that are running through our brain, and we're not even aware of this, but we see patterns in different things. The whole, Hortblotch test of, seeing patterns where they're not, is emblematic of this, and people view that as like a shortcoming of humanity. But ultimately, I think if you trace back all of our inventions, they become as a result of these, almost accidental, or, if even stupid, things that happen. It's not, uh, it certainly isn't something we should be ashamed of, in the sense that we, sometimes pull patterns out of nothing, and, inspiration can come out of nowhere. We don't really know. But I think, as a whole, in my generation, I don't mean to say we should be more like boomers, and we should love all these new advances in technology. I think there is a very, very healthy amount of pushback that people are getting, but I think older generations should recognize that all we've been told our whole lives is how pointless we are to technology, and how great it is, how much we suck, and how we're worse. And I know that's a thing throughout history of, like, all the old people all saw that. I mean, there's a hilarious thing back in, like, the, Greco-Roman times, where it's like, some philosopher, and they phrased it in some ridiculous way, because it's, a translation from Greek into English, but it's like, oh, this younger generation is so, I can't think of the word, but they're so, selfish, and they're so, they're all about, abundance and exorbitance and all this stuff, and how self-absorbed they are, and how bad they are. But of course, that was in like 300 AD or something like that. So that was, quite literally almost, 1800 years ago or so. Um, so I don't know. It's just funny to think that that's always been a thread throughout time. But now I think the, level of advancement and change, culture is, it does kind of follow with a lot of the developments in technology. You can see that with, like, the Industrial Revolution, and how much culture has changed since then. Because for the longest time, like, things didn't change much between generations, but because the kind of generational, churn is so great with terms of culture, in terms of references, because now there used to be a few classics people would read in the same, wouldn't be much different. But now, like, there's thousands of these new shows and movies, and it's impossible to keep up. So even, like, cultural references that used to stick around for a while, really have no, very little bearing. Like, there's people that they're talking about shows and things that they've seen, and there's not a single show or movie that they can name that I've actually seen. And maybe that's just because I'm out of the loop, and I don't like, I'm not a huge consumer of stuff, and I don't really think it's a great, modality to exist in. But literally, they're rattling off like dozens and dozens of things that are supposed to be these, like, cultural icon things that, like, everyone's seen. It's like, oh, everyone's seen Seinfeld. No, it's like, I don't even know what half of these things are. Like, I don't get this, right? Um, which I think just kind of speaks to the, I guess, how quickly, generations are different. And even with, you look at the generation below mine, like Gen Alpha, and you're like, well, what the fuck are they? I don't get any of what the hell they're talking about pretty much ever. It's all like, and again, we look upon any, younger generation with contempt. But to some extent, I think they're, older generations may be justified in how, in their cynicism towards younger generation. And then maybe even more so, our cynicism and our kind of flawed opinions towards even younger generations. I think there is some level of degradation happening, that shouldn't be ignored. But it kind of can begin with some mutual understanding of like why is it that we have this perverted relationship with technology? And again, I don't think it's totally unjustified. I think there is plenty of justification for why many people feel the way that I do. And some people do just drink the Kool-Aid and think everything is great and all it's gonna be wonderful and everything's perfect and like, oh well, my skills will never be automated, or we'll go to zero. But I suppose that cynicism will strike them later. I don't know. So anyway, I'll move on to something else here. Yeah, let's see here. Let me move on to a different one. I suppose I'll talk a little bit about, I guess, just the nature of consciousness as I, ruminate on this more. So, I'm reading this new book. I'm reading a new book, and this one is called "The Human Condition." It's by Hannah Arendt. It's like she was I think she was German philosopher, and this book was written in like 1960 or something like that. And she also wrote about like the banality of evil. That was another, I guess, writing of hers. But a question that she posited that I thought was quite interesting, was we have these kind of very, I'll say, fundamental metaphysical questions, of like, who am I and what am I? So who am I being like, who am I even suggests on its, in itself that there is a certain amount of like, self-awareness present, right? Who am I? That like I is a person, right? And now you're just inquiring as to the, not really the nature of the person, but the identity of that person. So who am I being that, you recognize that you are some sense of, personhood. Maybe that's not, maybe that person isn't, doesn't feel entirely like a human or something. I mean, the person that's asking that question obviously is a human, but for example, I suppose we can say if a computer is asking that question, it is still possessing some kind of personhood or selfhood or identity, and it's inquiring about that nature. And the other question that I think is more interesting and maybe has really evolved more than Hannah would think, is what am I? And what am I used to be a question about like, well, what are, on some level, what is a human? Like, why am I here, or what am I to do? What is this? It's a kind of a very fundamentally spiritual question, and there isn't really a way to answer that doesn't eventually become, quasi-religious in nature. But I think what we've done, or what we've tried to do at least, and I'm not really on this team, to put it that way, is we've tried to answer that with like reductionist, and in my opinion, very atheistic, materialistic, and overly scientific answers, and not in a way that is conducive to furthering any of those ends. So, like a true biologist would say, well, we're just this big giant clump of cells that has certain processes and things. And a chemist would say we're just a big ball of chemicals that do certain things. And a physicist would say that, well, we're all just these like atoms bouncing around. And a mathematician would say, I'm not even sure what a mathematician would say. What am I? But ultimately, all of these things are, science itself is an abstraction. And if you can't get out of that mode of thinking, and if you think science is this God, you then kind of begin to view that question with certainty, which I think is not the point of the question. The point of the question isn't to like, isn't to try to be certain about what am I, and to have answers with, related to what, the nature of human existence, or to, again, think in those abstractions. But I think science has, maybe largely poisoned people into thinking that those are correct answers or valid. And they're not saying they're entirely wrong in the sense that they're not, there's not, within the abstractions of physics or within the abstractions of chemistry, there isn't value in seeing that like, we're a clump of cells, or we're, atoms bouncing together. Again, on a given level of abstraction that can be useful, right? I think it's useful if like, diagnosing, cancer or something like that. Thinking about cancer cells is probably useful to think in that term of abstraction. I understand that. But when it comes to like what is largely a metaphysical or philosophy question, barking that we're just a bunch of chemicals bouncing together is not only not conducive. I don't know that it is even truthful, any more truthful than saying that we are a product of some god, right? I think that is even, holds equal truth value than like, some overly scientific chemical answer about something. Which again, maybe the scientist of choice would disagree, but in my mind, that's the same as, the chemist disagreeing with the biologist and saying, well, we're not, a clump of cells, we're a clump of chemicals. And then the physicist says, well, we're not a bunch of chemicals, we're a bunch of atoms. It's like, all right, well, chemicals are made of atoms, and then cells are made of chemicals. So I guess all of you are kind of right in some sense, but then, what are atoms made out of? And it's like, well, they're made of subatomic particles. Okay, well then what are those? And then it's like, well, these are just things we made up. It's like, all right, well, okay, that doesn't. How does that help you at all? What does that tell you about? Does that tell you anything, right, about like the whole macro thing? And that maybe I'm just too much of a, a phenomenologist in the sense that I want to think about things in terms of their practical utility, in terms of how they, the macro scale of a human. But thinking like trying to get down to the nitty gritty of like subatomic particles, on things that we can't even see or understand really. Once you get to the level of quantum mechanics, it's all kind of a clusterfuck. How does that help you to, get out of bed in the morning or to, in answering any of these questions about what am I? Like, why is that a help? Is that at all a helpful answer? No, it's not really, and it's not even since it's helpful. I don't know that it's even really true, or accurate. But I think it's our obsession with scientific thinking, or science, using science as some big cover, and people don't really realize how flawed all of that can be, right? People just, like any of the terms that we've coined for, natural selection, all of these are made up. We made them up, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Like that's totally fine. Even the names for colors, blue and red, we made that up, and that's fine. I'm not saying that we have to like go back to something that we didn't make up. We're allowed to make things up. That's totally fine. It's not. It's very useful to have made things up, but recognizing like treating it as some like, you know religious proof of something, or that like, God doesn't exist because we've made up the color blue, or that, a chemical process that we can observe and, and somewhat predict. That doesn't mean that doesn't pull value. Both things can exist and be helpful independent of one another. And I think too many people are trying to enforce and trying to push this, overly scientific reductionist materialist ideology onto, questions and ruminations that are largely spiritual in nature. And I mean, even if you look at the way that like Kant thought about, religion, in the sense that it you know, empirically wasn't something that was very, truthful, but it simply was as a way of dealing with metaphysical questions. And I think a large, maybe a large part of all the cynicism that younger generations deal with is a result of this, of science not really being helpful. And with regard to these questions, what am I? Who am I? What am I supposed to do? Why am I on this earth? What am I doing with my life? Like, what am I doing with any of this? Barking about clumps of cells or subatomic particles, that doesn't help you at all. It doesn't. How does that provide any way or reason to live? It doesn't. And that's why I've argued before that, like, science is suicidal, because there's, in thinking in the realm of science, and like trying to, weigh these utilitarian options, maybe it lands on you, oh, just kill yourself. And like that would be the answer that science gives you. Why the fuck would that be helpful? Like we didn't get to this point as, a species, by being, overly one dimensional in our thinking. So I think that's really all I'm boiling down to with this whole, diatribe about this, is that there's simply nuance with all of this. And there are, I'll say like helpful truths among other helpful truths, but to say that like something is an absolute truth is an absolute lie, right? Like saying science is absolutely true is absolutely not true, because science again is all we've made it all up, and that, again, that's fine. I'm not saying that we can't make things up and they can't be helpful in certain contexts, but to take them as absolute, unequivocal, unarguable truths, 100% of the time is not true. Again, if we're in a laboratory and we're doing chemical experiments, yes, we can say this is a helpful truth and this works in this context. But then, we're talking about what is beauty. Good luck, as a chemist trying to like, drop, I guess drops of chemicals on, the Mona Lisa and telling me how beautiful it is. It doesn't fucking work like that. There simply is a incalculable amount of some of this that is you have to chalk up to some level of divine or otherwise spiritual intervention. And being entirely atheistic and certain of your atheism, I think, is wrong. I think agnosticism is more like acceptable in the sense that your kind of uncertainty is almost your god. With agnostic, that's kind of the way I view it. Is that I think an atheist is like silly in how certain they are that there is no God, whereas in agnostics, their uncertainty is their God. So they kind of almost subscribe to this like pseudo chaos theory, where it's like, the world is this like chaotic place and it's unsure. Really anything could exist. Maybe it's 8-dimensional aliens, that are truly controlling, and they're what's underneath all of these experiments and things that we have. Whatever. It could really be anything. But ultimately, agnosticism isn't a super helpful religion either. I think there's almost needs to be this like, you know, uh, human goodness, or like even like a golden rule of some kind of religion that would be is at least far more helpful than a strictly agnostic thing. Because again, it's not a matter of like absolute truth. And if you're obsessed with things being absolutely true, you're gonna be running around in circles all the time, right? I think people go to philosophy because they want answers to things, but what they don't realize is that when you enter into philosophizing about things, you ultimately just leave simply more unsatisfied than you were when you started with more questions, right? It's not really philosophy itself is not a maybe it's cathartic in the sense that it's like it feels like a real thing to do, but ultimately it isn't. It's not giving you like answers to questions, at least answers that if you're again really thorough, answers that are gonna scratch that itch. I guess to put it that way. So people look for their answers within philosophy, but I think they're realizing maybe that searching at all is kind of the sin, right? And not even really the sin, but searching is what is what you're dealing with. You're dealing with the problem of searching, which again is not doesn't have its own answer, right? I think it's kind of it becomes circular in that way. Um, anyway, I just think it's interesting. The other way to think about this that might be more around like human cognition versus like I'll say like a spirituality of any kind, is that like we wouldn't balk at saying like an ant is incapable of seeing itself like as just an ant, right? So is it possible that we're incapable of seeing ourselves as just humans? Right? I think a quote was like, for living beings, life is just being, or like being itself, or like just living, or just existing, or doing, or again, those don't to any scrupulous observer, that's a very frustrating way to answer that. It's like, oh, life is being. It's like being what? It's like just standing there is being alive, doing something. Is there something I have to do? Is there a certain amount of physical action I have to take, or is it mental action I have to do? Or is there some? What are the criteria for like actually being? Like, and does this qualify you as alive? It's like, well, you are just being any like it'd be anything. Even if you're a crack addict, you're still technically like being and you're living, and that's like But is that like a good thing? Then it's like, all right, well, then how do you measure the degrees of being? Like if you're any more or any less, it's like these are very frustrating questions to people that are again maybe be very thorough in their thinking about things. But I think it's fair to say that while an ant wouldn't be able to abstract itself as just an ant among an ant's tail, and to contextualize it, and it's like, okay, I'm just one small insect on a creature, on the big planet. And maybe we can say we're better than ants because we've at least learned that we are again one creature on a planet among things. But beyond that, what do we know, right? What does an ant know of? What does an ant know of? What does an ant know of our fake chemistry shit? It doesn't really know anything, but no, nonetheless, it's still beholden to all of its all these laws that just came out of nowhere, right? It's not like we weren't really given answers for why gravity at all like exists. It's like it's something that we discovered, and sure, and we've used it to create helpful things. But why is it that like things have what we might call mass, but why what might a god or something call something different, or maybe six-dimensional alien calls it something totally different, but it's still just an observation that we've measured and we see. Why is that the case that it is? Like, we just have to accept it. And like, there's nothing that doesn't inevitably end up proving itself. I think Gödel did this very elegantly with his incompleteness theorem in mathematics. But I don't think people truly appreciate the gravity of that find with regard to all of our scientific methodologies. People tend to just kind of view things as like, you know, again, in this realm of science, the X Y Z might be a helpful truth, but to pretend that it's like this godly, like we've answered these philosophical questions that have plagued our race for millennia and for all of time, I think is totally untrue. We're not any closer to this enlightenment than we have been than the Greeks were, or the people before them, or even the cavemen, or even just like an ant or something. How can we say we're any closer to any form of divine enlightenment than them? That we made a rocket. We can bomb each other. We have a gun like that. That doesn't. How is that a proof of our superiority? I don't think it is. So I don't know. In the same way that an ant is kind of capable of seeing themselves as an ant, kind of a lesser animal wouldn't fathom anything beyond what we could. Doesn't have the language or the ability to do that. And so maybe language might be, the reason that we're better than someone else is we have some kind of language, right? But even going down to the ant, they have certain pheromones that is a language we can't comprehend. And sure, we could like measure the pheromones. We don't know exactly, like, is there anything beyond that? We don't know. We haven't observed that, and we could have intuition that like, well, no, it's as simple as this. It's simple as X, Y, Z. But I think if it were as simple as that, and we could, then we'd be able to have a completely programmable anthill, and we'd be able to, again, quite literally make ants that could do our bidding, and be building. We'd have a whole army of animal slaves of some kind if we were able to figure all that out. But I don't know. We're just not. I think we're a little bit too arrogant for what we've discovered and how meaningful it is. And as impressive as science is, it still doesn't. We're not any closer philosophically to any kind of absolute truth. And I think maybe the ultimate, way to think about it is that it's not. Again, these are questions for gods, and we're simply not capable of comprehending them. We need a six-dimensional mind or something like that. Our little two-dimensional, three-dimensional, or four-dimensional, however you want to think about it, because if you count time as a dimension, our minds can't really comprehend that. And even that, like, even a question about like how many dimensions do we think in? Dimensions aren't really real either, right? We made that up. And sure, it's like, again, it's helpful. I'm not saying it's not true in the sense that it's helpful, but I think our whole concept of truth is in some ways like a flawed concept, right? Things being like right and wrong. I don't know that anything even exists on that kind of spectrum, period. Again, there are things that are helpful and again, I could say are accurate in the sense that they're close to something, right? Or I'd say like a chemical equation for photosynthesis is closer than like, me rolling a dice to see what happens like with the chemicals. I understand that there's a level of accuracy, there's an accuracy discrepancy between those two methods of, study. But to say like one is there's an absolute truth associated with something, I think it's only purely asymptotic. Like we only ever get like closer to things that we might call, true. There isn't ever really a point where this is like an absolute truth. Like, so I guess to summarize this whole thing, we've stumbled upon zero absolute truths as a species. There is no absolute truths under which we've, I'll say discovered or we have. So I don't know. That's just my two cents. Anyway, maybe we'll move on to something else here. Yeah, let me see what's on my text list. Yeah, I suppose this is another interesting. This is just one way of contextualizing developments in large language models like AI systems. So humans are well known to have, I'll say, like pattern recognition abilities and things that there simply is no pattern. Even like even if I generate a completely random list of numbers, given an observer or someone who's dedicated enough to find something, or just give it to a schizophrenic, and they'll come back with some kind of meaning out of it. They'll draw meaning out of nothing, and maybe that's just like maybe that's where all this came from, all this scientific thinking, all this, just because we're so like because we're capable of being schizophrenic, we're able to draw meaning out of literally nothing. Um, and I think because large language models are trained on our, on our musings, in English language and in even other things like photos and things are still, it's a language of of sorts. Photos are, I guess, are, big matrices of binary information. That again, it equates to some form of language that computers can learn on. But in the same way that we're really good at again drawing patterns out of nothing, we're again also kind of imbuing that power with with large language models that can do that, and are again are kind of in the same way of humans kind of looking for patterns out of nothing. And I think that's where novelty can arise out of these systems. In the same way that it is, and that's why I think it's not like I can't say that for certain that large language models cannot do anything original ever. I'm not Xing that off as a possibility, but I'm saying there is a, in the same way it's not able to. I don't know that LLMs are capable of being schizophrenic. And maybe they are, like in terms of their output, meaning that like you could look at this and say this makes no fucking sense. This doesn't mean anything. This means nothing. But it still needs a human to then like even imbue that meaning on the text that you're getting, right? In and of itself, it has no meaning until a human looks at it and goes, "Oh my god, this means nothing," which is still like again assessing something for meaning, right? It still requires that like human intervention. And now you could like have a meta LLM that then like is tasked with then like does this have meaning or not? What does this mean? Which again, at some point, the snake's gonna end up eating its own tail. Like if you have meta LLMs, and maybe that's all humans really are, just a bunch of people intertwined with one another, kind of all trying to pull meaning out of stuff, from one another. But ultimately, we're fundamentally different biologically than computers that would do that, and you could have, I suppose, a whole series of meta LLMs above other meta LLMs that then are responsible for assessing and pulling out meaning from certain things. But then then the question comes of, all right, well then what is their what are they tasked with doing, right? Like what do you like at some point there has to be somebody that says do this, right? Otherwise there isn't really there's no meaning behind that. And with humans we know that there isn't, that is kind of the still that like perennial question of like who's telling us to do, what are we supposed to do, right? And it's like maybe some people say, oh, we got to go to Mars, we got to get off this damn planet, which again it's like why, I don't understand that. Like this planet's literally made for us. Like we've done great here, like we were a lot, there's food everywhere, there's water, we can breathe. Why the fuck are we going to what are we doing? Like our little monkey body is not built for this. So but that to me that's not a satisfying answer. I think the more satisfying answer is to that there we still need, we don't know. We need to think about it. And I think that this was interesting. I guess going back to my book that I'm reading now. In the preface to this Human Condition book by Hannah Arendt, it she simply is advocating. She's like, well, what's the point of this book? She's advocating to simply think what we are doing, right? Like just think about what we are doing, and that itself is like is a tough thing to, I guess, come to terms with, because it's like, well, what do you mean think about what we're doing? Like don't we think about what we're doing already? And it's like, what degree of thinking do we call like true, like thought, right? And maybe the thought, like we could delineate between like shallow thought and like deep thought, and maybe then say, oh, we want to deeply think about what we're doing. But then like, where's the threshold between shallow and deep thought? But I think all of this, it still comes down to like, are we being intentional about what we're doing? What is the plan here? Like I think largely we have lost. We have no defining plan. As scientists, and as even if you look at like the whole realm of science, some people might view that as like, okay, science's plan, the kind of guiding principle of truth for science, or the guiding principle for science is to find truth, whatever that means. And again, I've argued against absolute truth, for 30 minutes now in this episode. But regardless, that could be the kind of guiding characteristic of scientific endeavors. But even that, it's like if you dig into things, you don't. What is truth? Who's doing what? There's a whole level and whole layers uh, of incentives and different things that run completely contrary to this like truth above all else. Same with like medicine. Medicine's like, all right, we have to keep people alive above all else. But then there's like that still kind of largely ignores the philosophical questions of like, what if we're just torturing people by keeping them alive? What about dignity and grace and dying a graceful death? Like, is there and sure there's room for that in all of these areas of study, but regardless, there isn't like really a defining like unifying characteristic or philosophy of any of humanity. And even like between countries, this is very obvious. Like many countries throughout the world just have completely different ideas of what like the future is supposed to look like, and we have no we just don't agree on really anything. And this can be a good thing in the sense that we have many different opinions that we can then kind of pull parts from them. But I think in terms of unity, there is nobody knows what the fuck we're supposed to be doing and what we want to do and what the plan is. Um, so I think the wrong thing to do is to be uncertain and just be kind of randomly doing events, right? I think at that point we're splitting the timeline so many times we don't really know we don't know where we're gonna end up, or we'll have even more difficulty kind of putting all the pieces back together once that we've bombed ourselves back to oblivion. But I think maybe what the book is then advocating for is just a more deliberate thought process, or a more deliberate slow process in rolling out. And in my case, I have this technology skew, so I want to think about how we roll out technologies. Whereas in her case, she was a political philosopher, so hers is like, all right, how do we make political decisions? I think doing it brashly with no respect or you know no time dedicated to ruminating and to thinking about things, we run into problems. And same with, and again, my skew is technology. Same with technology. We can't just brazenly throw everything out there and hope it all works out. We simply need to think about what the fuck we're doing, because we aren't thinking. Anyway, that's my time. I'll wrap it up there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.